Hello friends, how you doing? Oh, I don't know why I'm shouting. My name is Richard Oliver, as you probably know since you're watching this, and welcome to my subscription tutorial page. Thank you so much for your support. I'm deeply grateful, as always, for your support. Today's tutorial is a painting that I made in the studio based on a study that I did on site, a plein air study that I did on site at Topanga Beach near Malibu. Now, it was an interesting study because it was the first time that I painted with the Santa Monica Allied Artists group. Because of COVID, we had obviously our masks on and there was social distancing. It wasn't a lead paint out, but there was about 4 or 5 artists that were in the little area that I'd chosen. And it was pretty fantastic to be out painting with other people. I enjoyed myself thoroughly. The other artists were incredible. There were some artists working with pastel. There was another professional artist recording their plein air study, and they're very pure plein air. That's all they do is paint outdoors. I will say that I got a little psyched. I wasn't so stoked on the painting that I ended up doing on the day. I think I rushed it. I was a little perturbed by the other artists looking over my shoulder, which usually doesn't get to me, but since I'm fairly new to plein air painting, it was it psyched me out just a little bit. So the painting ended up not being quite as nice as I liked. However, I did learn a lot from the experience. I started early. I chose something that was under shadow, and that shadow disappeared completely within about an hour. So it wasn't the best positioning. I rushed into it, and everybody else was finishing up their painting when I was about like halfway through. So I definitely rushed that painting, but it was really nice to meet the other people. However, that being said, I did learn a lot from the experience. I took a lot of reference photos while I was down there on the day, so that my studio painting that is part of this tutorial is a combination of my study and some of those photographs that I took. Now, the interesting part of this tutorial that I think is interesting was my color palette choice. And here's what I did. I took my study and I took a handful of photographs that I had taken on the day, and I manipulated those photographs based on some limited palette choices that I did. The first one I did was a quadratic, and I took my photograph, I took that quadratic palette, which I might be able to put up here. Maybe I'll put some of those color palettes up here. I selected a color palette, quadratic color palette that I liked. And then I manipulated the photographs by enhancing and taking away the colors so that the picture itself reflected the colors only in that quadratic. I wasn't very excited about the quadratic, so I decided to try another palette. And this time I chose a complementary palette. So it was using mainly a blue, and the complementary of that blue, which was a yellowy, orangey brown. And I was a bit happier with the manipulated photograph, how that felt. I saw them side to side. Now, I didn't want to be entirely a slave to the reference image, but it was a useful tool to limit the image to those complementaries. While I was actually making my painting, I was bringing in some more reds. I knew that, with the blue and orange, there wasn't a lot of reds. It was a yellowy orange. There wasn't a lot of reds or purples in the image. And I give myself freedom and flexibility to add those where I felt they were needed. With that being said, I did limit my actual paints on my palette to the complementary colors, with the exception of an earth red, which I put on my palette. So that gave me a lot more flexibility than a previous limited palette that I used. I don't know if you've seen the tutorial I did over at the avocado farm, but if you did, that was a fairly limited palette, and I struggled to get my greens because there wasn't much in the way of a yellow on my palette, which was crazy. But on this particular occasion, the limited palette worked well because I chose it to harmonize with the image that I had made. So Without making it overly complicated right now, I'm going to jump straight into my tutorial. Again, thank you so much for your subscription and your support. I am extremely grateful. I do apologize for the mess in my tiny little studio, but I thought I'd use my iMac for the introduction today, just so that I can move quickly on to the actual tutorial itself. I will be doing that voiceover, and hopefully you will learn some of the things that I learned by doing this process, by doing the harmony palette, selecting that harmony palette, using a harmonized reference image, and then building my painting from there. So again, thank you so much. Without any further ado, here's my tutorial of my painting down at Topanga Beach. Thank you. Rightio, let's get started. So I'm using a larger canvas than I would normally use. This is a 18-inch by 24-inch. It's a Frederick board, so it's a fine linen on some sort of organic board, which gives it a nice solid surface for me to push into. I've used these boards for portraits and I really like them. I'll get some more information on them shortly. Let me just pop down here. So as you can see, I am putting a coloured ground on, an orange ground. Now this is part of the colours that I've chosen for my complementary palette. The orange is going to be, because a lot of the image is blue, with it being ocean and sky. I wanted to use the complementary colour to the blue as my ground, so that if anything shows through, I'm just going to have that nice vibrant tone. I mixed with my Chelsea Studio lean medium, because since I've been using that Chelsea Studio medium, it gives a really nice surface of which to introduce the paint. So I mixed it with that and I wiped it back so that it dries. The lean medium dries pretty quick. Always adhering to the fat over lean, fat meaning the amount of oil content in that medium. So I start with a lean medium, put down my ground, and I'm just separating my canvas now into those thirds so that I can start sketching out the image. I've wiped away the sky area. I feel sometimes if my sky ground area is too dark, then I spend a lot of time trying to lay on the blues of the sky, and they start to mix with the ground and make that colour pretty muddy, because my sky colours and tones usually the highest. So I wanted to, wipe that away so that it dries quicker, so that when I'm putting the blues on, they're not picking up. I know ahead of time they're not going to pick up too much of the orange ground that I put down. But the rest of the painting, I wanted it to stay kind of oiled out. Now, oiled out is something that I do between layers sometimes when I'm doing portraits. If I've done some grisaille, some dead painting, underpainting, and I've let it dry, or I've taken a break from a painting and gone back to it, what tends to happen sometimes is areas, depending on how much medium I used or what colours I've used, some of those areas dry with like a gloss or a satin, some of them dry with like a matte. And so often I'll use like a very fine layer of Dharma varnish spray or a little bit of this lean medium on a cloth just to oil out the entire surface. Gives me a little bit of fluid to work my painting into, and it also brings it brings everything back to a uniform gloss, so I can see what the colours actually truly will look like when the painting is finished and varnished. But I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So let's go back to the painting. I'm going to block in my values. On this particular occasion, I haven't sketched anything out. I'm just literally going to get those values blocked in and build my painting from my value study. The other thing that I'm doing here, which I've started to do recently, when I'm blocking in my values, I'm using colors that are going to be relevant to the final image, the colors that are going to be the shaded areas of those particular elements that I'm painting. Now, in the past, I've used just a straight burnt umber to omit any hue and just get my values right, but I started to find it useful to introduce a little bit of colour, so like blues or greens. If I'm painting an area that's mostly green, I'm going to use a bluish, cold, darker bluish green colour for my initial value. Because when that dries, some of that under value painting is useful, and I let it come through. So I quite like the expressive brush strokes when I'm laying in those value areas. So a lot of it actually ends up making it through to the end of the the finished piece. So I'm using a large brush. I'm being quite expressive, and what I'm blocking in terms of value there is a cool green blue tone mixed with some browns just to get my values right. It's a lot darker in the video than it ends up being. This is just because when I set the aperture of my camera, I was looking at a white canvas. So that's a mistake, and it will be rectified shortly. Now that I've got my ground on that aperture, on the canvas, and I'm starting to lay in that value study, again, excuse me, I'll change the aperture so that it's way more balanced for the painting you're seeing. So it's not quite as dark as what you're seeing right now, but it will all correct itself. My ground is still a little wet. Like I say, I'm just working with values. And as you can see, I'm just adding little bits of colour into my value study here. Nothing opaque, just still sketching out, wiping away. Ooh, wiping away a lot. This is the reflection in the water on the side there. Still being really loose. As you see, I've not sketched anything out. I've barely even given myself a horizon. I just want to look at the image in terms of value right now. So it's almost as if I'm introducing colour into the ground. And I'm using the white, I'll be using the white of the canvas itself by wiping away certain areas. Okay. It's a strong blue. A lot stronger than, yeah, I'm going to put that on, then I'm going to wipe it away to get my values right. So I'm just covering the entire canvas. There we go. Covering the entire canvas with my base colours, or getting kind of close, just so that I got something to work with. You see, if I did all this in browns while I was working out my values, which is useful because then all I'm focusing on is value, then I'd have to pretty much let it dry before I'm able to work up some of my colours. So I'm combining steps here. I'm blocking in while also working my values. I also applied a useful method when blocking these paintings in. I took the original photograph and I made it monotone, and then I photographed my painting as I was going along, and I made that image monotone, and I compared the two monotone image, i.e. black and white images, to see if my values were close, and I corrected my values throughout the image by constantly referring to those two monotone black and white images. I can do that in the studio because I have time. I wouldn't be able to do that outdoors. I don't think. It would be a little bit too complicated, but it allows me to see and get my values correct even before I start working my colors. There's a lot of things you can do in the studio that you can't do outdoors, just because you have that consistency of the lighting and the elements. So wiping away, raising some of those values. And what I'm also not doing is quite often, I do my value study referring to the monochrome image, but the image that I have on my screen to the left there that I'm referring to is the full color version. So right now I'm just sketching in real time, referring to that image and just kind of learning to see my values a little bit better rather than overusing the tools and methods that I have been using. It's my ultimate goal to be able to look at a full color image, and maybe not even a reference image, to look at nature and then determine correct values from that image. Right now, I do rely quite a bit on technology in order to, separate and break down that image into a black and white so that I can see those values. That's just because I'm not as experienced. But it's good practice to just continue to try and do that. This is a nice stage. This is a bit of a messy stage, but it's nice because I can just work with a rag and a big brush and just be kind of fluid and flexible with my mark making. Sticking to that lean principle again, making sure that everything's real thin on that initial layer. The Chelsea Classical Studio materials that I've been using, I also sell over at my store. So if you're interested in getting some of those mediums, I absolutely adore the brush cleaner, the lavender brush cleaner. But these new fat and lean mediums are they've changed the way that I work, and they've changed, they've really enhanced what I'm able to produce. I just love the fluidity of them, how they allow me to blend. It's wonderful when there we go. I just adjusted the aperture on my camera. I was like, wow, that looks too dark, right? That's much better. So you get a better idea now of my value study. And over in those shadows on the left-hand side of all the greenery there, you can see, it's kind of a grayish, muted blue-green tone. Behind my lighted areas there in the sky and the sea, I just used the tones from my limited palette. I'll bring you my limited palette on as a picture-in-picture so that you can see what I'm working with. So I feel pretty good about that that area. I'm starting to raise some of those values now. Adding more opaque paint at the top, lightening the sky. I'd got to the edge of where I could wipe things away. I didn't want to reveal too much. I didn't want to wipe away too much of the ground, but I also didn't want to use too much of the white of the canvas. This value layer is just, this value sketch is just an underpainting with the knowledge that a lot of it I'm going to paint over. It's just a guide. for me to mix to and make sure that I'm matching. Now I'm going with the sky first. Quite often I do the sky first because that's always, in principle, going to be my lightest area. Reason for this, obviously, is that's where the light source is coming from. So when I'm on my palette, I want to mix that lightest area, and I keep a little bit of that sky area on my palette so that I can compare all the values of all the other colours that I'm mixing, make sure nothing gets brighter than that light area. Using a big old brush and using the tooth of the canvas as well to give me some texture in that sky. As you can see, using the brush almost like the flat area of that rosemary brush. I'm still using those filbert bristle brushes to keep my texture. Sky holes. So I've learned quite a bit from Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting and Edgar Payne's composition of outdoor painting. If you're ever interested, those are some incredible reference reading material which you can learn from. So Carlson's Guide to Landscape Painting, there's a lot of information about the sky holes in trees and how our eyes determine those sky holes. Quite often in the past, myself and I notice, amateur painters tend to put too many sky holes in and they make those sky holes the same color as the sky. Our eyes diffuse those sky holes when we're looking at a tree. There's a tendency to look into the area of the tree and see so much of the blue coming through the foliage, and then we paint it all in, and then before you know it, the mass of that tree has been altered, and you lose it. You lose the shape of the tree and you lose its value. What Carlson says is the smaller the sky hole, the less its value, less bright it is. It's almost as if you need to really keep squinting at the tree and not over lighten the value of those sky holes. So I've made a point to make sure whenever I'm doing any sky holes, unless they're big sky holes in the tree, to make sure they're much darker in value, or relatively darker in value, than the sky around it. And that also applies to the edges of the tree where the tree meets the sky. You need to make sure that those edges around the tree are slightly darker and the foliage is slightly lighter. It's not a blur. You can do it with transitioning color, but making sure, being very mindful of not putting, making those sky holes too big and too bright. Definitely not as bright as the sky around them, because there's a transition that you have to take into consideration. So if you'll notice that this, the holes, the blue areas in my tree, well, you probably can't see it from this image, but the blue areas in the tree are much darker than the sky, the open area of the sky. And that's really helped give the illusion that, you can see through the tree without that area just popping forward and just really spoiling the mass, just keeping that tree mass and just being selective about the sky holes. Less is more, really, when it comes to sky holes. Otherwise, you just lighten the whole area of the tree mass and it no longer sits in the painting where it should sit. So correcting the value on the water there. Starting to get some of the texture of the waves. Or I should say the swells in the ocean. So again, referring to my color palette, my selected color palette with those complementaries. The image itself is mostly browns and blues. And whatever greens you see, they lean towards the blue end of the hue. When I laid out my colours, I'm using mostly a phthalo blue as my primary colour on my palette. That's why you get in these very cool, almost, well, when phthalo is mixed with white, you get that kind of cerulean blue. There's a little bit of purple coming in. I did put some, a cool red on my palette, alizarin. I'll say that twice forever. Just so it allowed me to do a little bit of purple, but I didn't want to overdo my purples. I didn't want to overdo my reds. I mean, most of the reds that you will see will come through in my browns rather than, you know, a strong red. So I didn't want to overdo the purple. In my reference image, there wasn't a lot of purple. In fact, I omitted a lot of the purple and the reds so that I kept to the complementary palette that I'm working from. So right now, you know, I've got a lot of sort of phthalo mixed with white, a little bit of yellow, quite a bit of yellow ochre on my palette as well. I put both my yellows on there. I put my cadmium medium and my cooler yellow, which is a Hansa yellow. And I also knew that the image itself had a lot of ochre in it. So I put, from a tube, I put some yellow ochre onto my palette. The only reds is the earth red, transparent earth red, and the alizarin red, which is a cool, leans towards the cooler side of the spectrum. I'm being quite mindful with my reflections. Reflections are interesting to me. The reflections tend to be darker in the light areas and lighter in the dark areas of the reflection. So it's almost like it's been consolidated. You bring in the brighter areas down and the darker areas up, so it's more narrow in the value range. Start using a flat ivory by Rosemary just to start to get some of those sharper edges. And now that that lean layer of ground that I put on and wiped away is pretty tacky and dry, you know, I could push into it and release some of the color of that ground, but I'm also able to paste over the top with fairly thick, high contrast paint. As long as I'm gentle with it, it's almost like using that brush as a palette knife. I can paste over the top without picking up any of that under layer. Interesting fact here, in this particular painting, one of the highest areas was the sand. Generally, principle is the sky is the lightest value, but on occasions, the surface plane that is facing the sky, which is usually your second, in principle, your second lightest value, because obviously that entire surface plane is facing directly perpendicular to the light source. That's going to be your second lightest area on this particular occasion because it's sand. And generally when it's snow, that's going to be heightened in its value. Sand usually then becomes as bright, if not brighter than the sky, depending on the direction you're looking. On this occasion, the sky area is horizon, so that's always going to be a little bit darker than if you were looking towards the zenith or wherever the light source is, i.e. the sunlight, the sun itself. In snow, that's going to be even brighter. Generally, the snow area is the highest value in a painting. But if you're painting anything else, for the most part, principle is that flat surface of the earth, the plane of the earth that's facing the sky, is generally your second lightest value, unless it's sand. And you're turned away from the light source. Now, the sun in this particular image was almost directly above us, so that's why that sand area is going to be the brightest value. Once I've got my brightest value in, I'm working on the foliage. Now, I'm adhering to my palette choice here by making the highlights of the foliage of those bushes brown. Very little green. I mean, if there's any green, it's going to be my cool phthalo blue mixed with a yellow ochre to create green, but very little of that blue. So really trying to keep my palette mostly browns and blues and oranges, and avoiding too much green, just so that I stay within that complementary color harmony palette. It's interesting for me to do that. Okay, so I'm still blocking in. This I consider to be laying in the colors and not overworking any of the details. I did what I mentioned earlier. I took a value black and white image of the reference image and put it alongside my painting, and realized I need to do a little bit of editing to my values. So I'm raising some of those values in along the edge of the water where it meets the land. But for the most part, you know, my values are pretty much locked in right now. My colors feel good. The value of those colors, the brightness or darkness of those colors feel pretty good. So I'm starting to, you know, reduce the size of my brush and start to fine tune some of the areas in the painting. I do apologize, my camera went off, so there was a bit of a jump and we missed a little bit of the process. I've gone in and I've tuned the sky, put a little bit of a highlight onto the water surface where the wave is and the reflection of that. So we missed that, I'm afraid. But again, it's only blocking in. I think I did struggle with this water area and getting the value and color and shadow and intensity of the elements that are under the surface. So there's, like, water is difficult because there's so many things going on. You've got the reflection of the sky, and then you've got elements on the surface of the water, and then you have elements underneath the surface. And quite often our eyes focus on one or two of those things, but maybe not all three at the same time. So sometimes it's useful to break that water down into like abstract forms. And really, if you've got a reference image, I find it very difficult to do outside, because with the water moving, you've got what's under the surface, what's on the surface, the reflections, the colors, the values. You know, it's just a really challenging thing to do while in the field in real life. But when I'm referring to an image on a screen, it's a little easier for me to like disassociate with the subject and really just look at the abstract qualities of color and value and shape. Sometimes zoom in and forget that I'm painting water and just look at the elements. On this particular occasion, there was like some weed or like seaweeds which was coming through the surface of the water, and also like growing from beneath, so it was dark underneath, but that dark area was reflecting the sky. The light area was, really picking up the light from the sky. There was just so much going on. It was important to keep that mass separate and uniformed in relation to the big foliage mass on the left side of the image. But I also wanted to get that plane, the water plane, correct. So there's a lot of angle. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of angles on that water surface. I got to make sure that I'm adhering to the surface of the water, but also picking up those different shapes that are in the surface of the water. So I'm not going to say I struggled, but I did put a lot of time and effort into making sure it didn't just look like either or flat water or some weird abstract pattern on the right hand side. At this point, because I'm blocking in, it does look like a weird abstract. There's no perspective on that water. The only perspective I could get was later on when I was picking up some of the ripples on the water, and also making sure that the I don't know what to call it, like the debris, not debris, let's just call it seaweed for the time being. The seaweed that was actually breaking through the surface of the water was in keeping with the plane of the surface of the water, if that makes sense. That was very important to give the illusion of depth. Correcting some of those values now. I feel like I made them, the dark areas, too dark. They didn't sit well with that entire mass on the bottom third of the image. I mean, if you look at the image as a whole, you've got a dark mass on the left, which is the foliage. You've got a medium mass over on the right, and then the top almost third of the image is light. So I think that's what drew me to this composition. It was really nice big masses. There we go. That makes it a bit better. Keeps it interesting. Keeping the diagonals of those mass areas, not making them too symmetrical. So here's a hard thing. The portion of green grass that is transitioning from the foliage, which is almost bang in the center of the image, just looks like this blob. There's no perspective in that. There was no element in that green grass to heighten the perspective. So I had to bring in some textures and add little elements to that grass area so that I set it on a plane which was consistent with the perspective of the rest of the image. I do that a little bit later, but early on you can see it's just like a medium value, medium color green blob protruding out in the center of the image and really taking away from the focal points and the spoiling the composition a little bit. I had to work to get that to sit and fit in place. Here's what I was talking about earlier, making sure the planes of the seaweed that was actually protruding through the surface of the water were all in alignment with the plane of the surface of the water. Bear in mind, I was on a raised elevation right now. This photograph reference image was from a bridge. So I was a good 15, 20 feet above the surface of the water. And the plane of the water would change, obviously, depending on my vantage point. So it was a little bit challenging to make sure that you could look down on the water and see those, make sure that plane was consistent throughout the image. So I'm blocking, continuing with my blocking in. And right about now, I'm going to start to wrap up my block in. So this section you've seen so far is my $5 subscription, my basic entry level subscription. If you have subscribed to my basic level, you've seen some of the other videos that I've done. And I'm very, very, very grateful for your time, for your custom, for your patronage, for supporting me and my family. The second half of this painting is for my advanced level membership, which is $10. If you want to upgrade at any time or downgrade or cancel at any time, you can do so. In my second half, I go into my details. I fully blocked in my paintings and I start working on correcting some of those elements. It's not quite as much physical work, but it is the most important work, I think, in a painting. Correcting, fine-tuning, adding texture, really bringing the painting alive. Blocking in the painting is, as I've described before, is like playing golf. It's your driver and your long irons. You do the most work in terms of physical work, and you use the most paint. But I don't think it's the thing that differentiates between a successful painting. I think that always comes in the more thoughtful aspect at the back end of the painting. So if you ever want to upgrade to my $10 membership, feel free to do so, and I'll be talking about all of those elements. So thank you so much for supporting. I'm moving on to my second part of my painting for my advanced level members.